theologian nor an academic. I'm simply a basic international civil servant. My comments will necessarily reflect that limitation that I bring to the table. And the first sign of that realization will be my first statement, which is that while I am an official of the United Nations, my comments here today reflect my own opinions and do not reflect those of the United Nations or the UN Alliance of Civilizations. I want to thank Basil and the International Center for Ethno-Religious Mediation for including us in today's program. And at the outset, I have to say that these types of opportunities to talk about shared values, and as some of the speakers have alluded to, while we're talking about the Abrahamic faiths, the importance of how some of these shared values extend into the Eastern traditions as well, is always something that we consider to be important. Dr. Walsh has already talked about the basic building block elements of UN interest in this topic in talking about the World Interfaith Harmony Week, but I would extend that to include the annual reporting that is done to the General Assembly about the promotion of the culture of peace. And in fact, an event that my own organization participated in the spring of 2015 that involved Sheikh bin Bayan, in fact, which was the high-level thematic debate that the High Representative for the Alliance of Civilizations, along with the Secretary General and the President of the GA, hosted on the role of religious leaders in peacemaking. So these types of topics come back. They are a natural and normal part of what the UN talks about and what the UN prioritizes. Today, however, I want to talk to you about certain other issues. And frankly, what I think I'm supposed to be bringing to the table in settings like this is what I sometimes describe as the cold water of reality. Fortunately or unfortunately, some of our previous speakers have already started doing that. And so I'm already in a position where I can extend on thoughts that have already been made rather than bring up necessarily new ones. The focus of this event is the exploration of shared values, and of course this is essential. And recognizing that the values exist across the Abrahamic family is a critical element to building understanding and tolerance across religious lines. And in that respect, I was just overwhelmed by the discussion amongst our three amigos when I first arrived this morning, and I don't want to underestimate the importance and the power of that conversation. But I have to tell you that your challenge will be greater once you start to deal beyond the concept of these shared values and start recognizing the fundamental dilemmas that exist within this topic. Dilemmas that include distinguishing between faith and the values that our colleagues espoused and ritual, between values and practices, between religion itself and identity, the emphasis of one over the other, the inability to balance these understandable competing interests. They surely complicate our ability to use faith as a healing tool in conflict situations. These challenges complicate the role of religion and faith in the field of peacemaking and conflict resolution, and most importantly, they kind of outline the level of work that needs to be done as we go forward, trying to promote these important shared values. Let's talk about where these tensions lie. I'm going to try to talk about two separate areas in which I think they arise. One is the tensions within faith themselves, and this is that issue of values versus ritual. And then the second comes back to something that Professor Schiffman was talking about, and I'm going to expand on this. That is the tension between expectation and reality that is sometimes reflected in our use of language, as he talked about earlier. And I think these two areas really merit further exploration in your conversations as we go forward. I speak as someone who spent considerable numbers of years in conflict environments in places where some of these tensions have come to the surface, either in terms of causing or being part of the causes of conflict, and certainly in many cases being part of the reason why conflict has been sustained and why resolution has been difficult to achieve. And so how does this fit in? Well, in the context of the tensions between faith and ritual, you inextricably find yourself drawn back to the issue of identity. When we talk about the Balkans, and a couple of our speakers have alluded to the wars of the former Yugoslavia, I have found virtually no evidence, having spent 4 years there myself, both during the war and then the post-conflict peacemaking phase after, that religion was a cause of that breakup. I just can't find it. On the contrary, the numbers would suggest to you that an ability to have a shared identity based on nationality transcended issues of religious identity, and in fact, religious identity was simply a matter of part of the mosaic that made up being a Yugoslavian prior to the breakup. And what are the figures that really tell you something about that? Look to the issues of intermarriage within the ethnic groups, especially in Bosnia in particular, but not just in Bosnia, in Serbia, in Croatia, in Macedonia. All of these places had mixtures of ethnicities and religions that had survived not just since World War II, but for a very long time before World War II. That's why, and I would do this every time visitors came to Sarajevo, I would take them on a walk. Sarajevo is a very compressed city, very dense. And the oldest section of the city, it's like an onion, where the core in the old Turkish area called Basarşehir then extends into another layer that represents the Habsburg time, and then another layer that represents the communist time. Well, in that Ottoman section of the city, I will take you on a walk that shows you the original old mosque of Sarajevo. We'll make a left-hand turn and walk about 200 meters. Make another left-hand turn, and there you will find the original Eastern Orthodox Church, built in the same century. And then we'll continue walking down that street, about 100 meters. And just across the street on the left, the original synagogue of Sarajevo, also from the same century. And then, because it was built later during the Habsburg period, it's a little bit longer walk, maybe 2 to 3 minutes further. There's a cathedral that the Catholic Church built in the 19th century. And so when someone tells me, oh, ancient hatreds, these people couldn't get along, this war was inevitable, I say, come on a walk with me. And so when we start talking about shared values, what our friends were talking about this morning represents the highest aspiration of what we want people to be talking about when they speak of religion. And in particular, when they speak of religion in the context of peacemaking and post-conflict peace building. It unfortunately does not represent the way in which people talk about religion, and I distinguish here between religion and faith, religion and values. It's not the way they talk about religion in conflict settings. And Professor Schiffman alluded to that as well in terms of his analysis of what is going on in the Middle East. What it comes back to is the issue of identity. And in the context of some of the conflicts of the modern era, what we find is that politicians will be the ones who highlight distinctions of identity. And where religious leaders get co-opted into the situation is that religious leaders will be used as leverage to find legitimacy in the arguments of the politicians. Not because there's some inherent connection between faith, values, and the issue of identity, but because there isn't. What does exist is an inherent sense of legitimacy that can be conveyed by religious leaders within communities because of the position that they hold, the position of responsibility, the position of trust that they hold. That's where you see the conflation. And objectively, not one that makes any sense, but we see it happen time and time again between religion, faith, values, and identity. And the challenge for religious leaders becomes one of how do you separate these things out? How do you talk like our friends talk? Not just in a setting like we have here today, but in Sarajevo in 1992, when some politician is saying, you're not a good Muslim unless you're defending the city. You're not a good Serb unless you're supporting the ethnic cleansing of that Muslim neighbor of yours. You're not a good Catholic unless you run off and become part of the Croatian majority. This is where the rubber meets the road when we talk about religion, identity, values, and conflict. The second issue that I want to address is the one that was originally mentioned, I believe, by Professor Schiffman, when he was talking about the issue of peace and reconciliation as opposed to justice. This is essential. I'm going to talk about two different definitions of terms, because when we define the terms in an objective fashion, our expectations have to be tempered to fit the definitions, not the other way around. When we talk about tolerance, in fact, before I do that, let me go back to some of the language that our three amigos used this morning relating to the shared values, because I think it's so beautiful and better than what I was going to be using. Let's think back to some of the shared values they described. Unconditional love, grace, forgiveness, compassion. I didn't see any of that in the 1990s when I was working in the Balkans. I didn't see it in Somalia. And I hadn't seen it in some of the places I worked in when I worked for the Carter Center in the last decade. Why not? In some cases, it's because the way in which we define the terms are absolute. And we expect that we're going to be reaching the highest level, the highest attention of the terms that we use. So let's turn back to the kind of terminology I was going to describe, like tolerance. Tolerance is not the same as acceptance. Tolerance is not the same as embracing. Tolerance, if you really want to get technical, and I wrote this down, so I'll be careful about this. Tolerance can be defined as sympathy or indulgence for beliefs and practices differing or conflicting with one's own. Think about what that means. It means that if someone's belief is different from yours, it's not that you absorb it, it's not that you accept it, it's not that you approve of it. It's that you have sympathy, or that you indulge their ability to have those values. Look, the term tolerance, it can get even more further afield and even more attenuated from that aspirational norm. The capacity of the body to endure or become less responsive to a substance or a belief, that's tolerance too. The allowable deviation from a standard. Think about that one. We have standards that we accept as our own. Tolerance can be the acceptable deviation of someone else from our standard. When we accept that we are looking to accomplish goals that do not reach the point where everyone's friends again, that everyone is meeting as partners, but rather that people can live side by side in peace, that's better than living in a world in which they're trying to kill one another. And from the perspective of a UN civil servant, that's a pretty big deal. But let's take it a step further. I want to try one other term out on you, and this comes back to what Professor Schiffman was talking about, and that's the term reconciliation. I've seen a couple of different terms or definitions of the term that suggest that it represents the resumption of amicable relations between states. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. But it can also mean the state of being reconciled, as when someone becomes resigned to something not desired. Let's think about that element of the definition of the term reconciliation. Peace agreements, by their very nature, represent compromises between parties who previously were prepared to kill each other. The idea that you are going to move from a posture where you consider it acceptable to kill your neighbor to one in which you are going to have amicable relations with them tomorrow is probably not the most realistic posture to try to take if you are trying to negotiate a peace deal. France and Germany did not become friends overnight after May 8th, 1945. The signing of a surrender document did not automatically render that to be true. Egypt and Israel signed a peace agreement in 1979. They haven't been shooting each other for over 35 years. But I would venture to say that most Egyptians and most Israelis do not consider their relations to be warm, amicable, and friendly. But is it better than it was in 1979? Yeah, I think objectively we can say it's better. The point that I'm making is that if we are accurate in our rendition of what it is we're trying to accomplish, our chances of being disappointed if we do not reach some aspirational goal is going to be better accepted. One of the things that our amigos talked about today was compassion, not only for others, but for ourselves. Incremental approaches to peacemaking represent the real world. And as we move forward in these types of issues, it's important for us to think about just how positive those advances can be. I mean, when we talk about interfaith dialogue, that's yet another term that I think represents the potential for disappointment in some people. The term dialogue in and of itself is an ancient Greek root that represents the exchange of ideas. It does not define itself as an agreement between competing ideas. It does not define itself as the resolution of a debate. It represents the exchange of ideas. Now, I will tell you quite frankly from my experiences at the table that dialogue represents one of the most critical tools that one has to try and get to the point where you do have resolution. And you're not going to get resolution without dialogue. But to complicate our expectations of dialogue by suggesting at the outset what the outcome or the definition of a successful outcome is going to be is probably not helpful to the use of the term and the expectations that we create in people who are going to be involved in a dialogue process. And so I want us to be sensible and careful in the way in which we address these issues. The concept of justice that Professor Schiffman talked about, I think, is also pretty interesting. Having worked in one of the war crimes tribunals in one part of my career, the notion that accountability can be put aside for peace and reconciliation is going to be a difficult one to sell going forward. And as Dr. Walsh indicated, you're already seeing the tensions that exist there in the way in which certain African countries are now looking at the ICC. It doesn't mean that you walk away. The fact that the tensions exist and that the arguments will continue do not excuse the need for us to try to find a way to both reconciliation and accountability. But it does make clear what the challenges are in trying to accomplish those sometimes competing goals. I can still remember in 1996 being in a room in Sarajevo after the war where we actually had to renegotiate an element of what was happening in the Dayton Agreement because there was a threat to the Dayton Agreement because of the arrest of certain Bosnian Serb officers by the Bosnian government, as opposed to an arrest made by international officials to send them to ICTY, the tribunal in The Hague. It was that sensitive an issue. And it points out the seriousness of the kind of conflict, the kind of tension that Professor Schiffman alluded to. I'm going to close here because I think in all likelihood you're going to be benefiting more from the Q&A than from me continuing the talk. But I want to put it to you in this framework. The issues that we're dealing with here through the recognition and the promotion of shared values within the Abrahamic family can never be underestimated. And the fact that you're dealing with these dilemmas of faith versus values versus identity should not dissuade you from continuing to push to have the values take the center of the arena in these discussions. What it does is it continues to remind all of us of the pressures that will come to bear from forces that will seek to use the legitimacy and the leverage that comes from faith communities and in particular religious leaders, and the importance that we have to place upon our collective effort as a global community to insist that the values in the international political sense take their proper role as leading the way in these conversations and not the elements that divide, the exclusive as opposed to the inclusive, that divide societies and divide identity groups. Thank you.